If you looked at the recent results of both the Canadian men and women's football teams right now, you would think that Canadian football was in a great spot. Only 2 years ago, the girls won gold at the Tokyo Olympics, while the men's team went to the Qatar World Cup, their first World Cup since 1986. But despite this, the Canadian Football Federation have announced they may file for bankruptcy. So today, let's talk about how a football federation who seemingly has everything going for them is actually in deep, deep trouble. After the death of the Canadian Soccer League in 1992, there was no professional football league running in Canada for 27 years. The Canadian Professional League started in 1998, but that was only considered semi-professional. For 13 years, there were no pro teams in Canada. Not one. Eventually in 2005, 2009 and 2012 respectively, the MLS introduced 3 Canadian teams in Toronto FC, Vancouver Whitecaps and Montreal Impact. And that was great. But if you went from Toronto, Vancouver or Montreal, there wasn't really any way you could start a pro career. For women's football, there was the USLW League, which was a good development league for Canadian and American women footballers, but once again this was only semi-professional. And that was why for a while Canada was awful at football. Young aspiring male athletes saw how unlikely a road to football stardom was in Canada and instead opted to play hockey or basketball. To be fair, girls were more interested in football in Canada, and the country has produced some incredible women's footballers. But the thing is, when you look at all the players who have come through for Canada's women's team, most of them got their first real break at a college in the United States. So to recap all of this, Canadian football was terrible. But why do I tell you this? Well, in 2019, Canada finally opened a new professional league, the Canadian Premier League. As mentioned, it was their first professional league in 27 years, and it finally gave a clearer pathway to professional football for kids outside of Toronto, Vancouver or Montreal. And this was great, long overdue. But as we'll soon learn, funding a football league involves spending a lot of money. In 2018, a year before the CPL started, the Canadian Football Federation struck a deal with the Canadian Soccer Business, or the CSB. Now, the CSB were crucial in creating the Canadian Premier League and creating more jobs in Canadian football. But keep in mind, the CSB are responsible for everything in Canadian football. On the CSB's website, they say they're committed to helping broadcast the CPL, the Canadian Championship, which is basically Canada's FA Cup, and both national teams. The problem? This hasn't exactly happened. In February of this year, Canada Soccer announced budget cuts to both the men's and women's teams. According to the contract signed back in 2018, the CSB owe Canada Soccer a base salary of $3 million every year. But after that's paid, CSB uses any extra revenue to put towards the CPL. But why does so much money go towards the CPL, I hear you ask? Well, owners of numerous CPL clubs have ties to the CSB. Now you see the problem. So to sum it up, the CPL are getting more money than the national teams aren't. But is that really a problem? Well, yes. The Canadian national team has had financial issues all year. At the start of 2022, Canada had $7.1 million in cash reserves, which is like emergency money or savings money. At the end of 2022, Canada's cash reserves had fallen to $2.4 million. And that was for both national teams, the CPL and the Canadian Cup. And both the men and women national teams have started to voice their concerns about it. It started when both teams made a complaint in February after the budget cuts were announced. The men's team issued a statement saying how Canada Soccer is allocating or using funds is unclear and cloaked in secrecy. But the women's team took it a step further and threatened to boycott the upcoming She Believes tournament. Captain Christine Sinclair led the protest by saying, "It's gotten to a point where, at least for me personally, until this is resolved I can't represent this federation. As a team, we've decided to take job action, and from this moment on we'll not be participating in any Canadian Soccer Association activities until this is resolved." In the end, Canada Soccer actually threatened legal action against the players, and they did play in the She Believes tournament, though they put in a meek showing finishing last. But the battle was far from over. As we know, the Women's World Cup is happening right now, and Canada hasn't exactly looked strong. Despite being ranked 7th in the world, Canada drew 0-0 to a Nigerian team ranked 33 spots below them. They also needed to come from behind to beat Ireland 2-1, and after getting absolutely battered against Australia with the hosts winning 4-0, they were eliminated from the World Cup. But why did Canada put up such a poor showing at this World Cup? Yep, you guessed it, budget cuts. Canada had to cut down on training camps, removing days from some and removing other camps completely. They also had to cut down on the amount of players and staff invited to these camps, and they didn't get a send-off before the World Cup. In fact, Canada's opening match of the World Cup against Nigeria was their first match in 100 days. But I've only talked about the women's team, so what about the men? The Canadian men's team weren't initially as vocal about these budget cuts on the women's side, but they have started talking about it more. After Canada played in the CONCACAF Nations final against the USA, in which they lost 2-0, manager John Herdman talked about the financial situation that the men's team was in. A few days later, Jason DeVos, who scored the winning goal for Canada in the 2000 Gold Cup final and was now the country's General Secretary, confirmed Herdman's claims. DeVos decided to call out the CSB for favouring the CPL, saying, "I know how important it is to have professional leagues for men and women in our country, but that cannot come at the expense of our men's and women's national teams." Only for a CSB spokesperson to say, "We respectfully disagree with those comments." Oh, God's sake, man. DeVos also mentioned that on plane flights, Canada couldn't afford to buy the players first-class seats. They also haven't been able to fixture any friendlies due to a lack of funding, and if they do, Canada's men's team may just boycott them anyway. That's something that's already happened, with Canada's friendly versus Panama getting called off last year after Canadian players boycotted due to, you guessed it, a lack of pay. Also, the under-17s men's youth team, who are meant to be playing in their own World Cup in November, are getting even less support from the CSB. But I've talked about the national teams enough. Let's focus on the CPL. In 2021, the CSB revealed that it took $4 million a year to keep the CPL afloat, and that $60 million were invested into the league. And while that makes sense, it is a lot of money, especially when you're taking it from 2 national teams. But if the CSB is so invested in the CPL, then surely it's one of the greatest leagues in the world, right? Surely the fans pack the stadiums full and the players put on some of the best games in the world. Well, to confirm this theory, let's look at a top of the table clash between Pacific FC and Cavalry FC from last month. These are the top of the table clashes that the CSB built this league for. Surely it would be pandemonium. Huh? Where is everyone? Bro, who are you shushing? Nobody's there! Look, I'm not going to hate on the CPL for low crowds. This league has been up for 5 seasons and 2 of them were interrupted by the pandemic. But I'm just saying, this is what the CSB are investing all their money into? This? But I was curious to see how much revenue the CPL had made after investing $60 million into the league. And the answer is $8.5 million. So yeah, it's not exactly looking good.
Big man thing, yeah? It's not looking good, bruv. It's not looking good.
Look, if you think my opinion is that the CSB should shut down the CPL and stop investing in it, you're wrong. The CPL is actually crucial to the growth of Canadian football. Like I mentioned earlier, there's finally an easily accessible path for Canadian footballers to come from an MLS city. And the CPL has already proven to be a great development league not just for Canadians, but for all young footballers who need a chance. I think the league's on the right track. With that being said, you can't just neglect the national teams to grow the league. In my opinion, the national teams need to be the one to grow the league, not the other way around. As someone who's from Australia, I do see a lot of similarities between our football culture and Canada's. And in Australia, you will see the A-League try to build off the success of the national team. And I'm not saying that the Australian football system is perfect. It's far, far, far from it. But in my opinion, this is a better way to build your league than just neglecting the national team and investing a ton of money into it. But the thing is, no matter how bad the A-League can be, at least I can say that these are the best clubs in my country. Canadians can't. So, is it time to get rid of the Canadian clubs in the MLS? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, sure, getting Toronto FC, CF Montreal, and Vancouver Whitecaps in the CPL would help out the league, but it would also be incredibly one-sided. So maybe that's not it. But either way, the CPL needs to do something, because while the CPL isn't failing, it's not exactly doing well enough to warrant all the investment that CSB has given them. And let's not forget, the next few years are huge for Canadian football. Next year, the 2024 Paris Olympics are on, and the women's national team will be looking to go back-to-back and win gold again. But if they play like they did in the World Cup this year, that won't happen. There's also the news that in 2025, Canada will begin a new women's football league. And that's great, long overdue, but the CSB is struggling to support one league. How are you going to run 2? But the real big event for Canada is in 2026, when they host the Men's World Cup along with the USA and Mexico. So I hope the CSB start treating their national team with a little more respect, because otherwise their home World Cup could be a disaster. But that is going to wrap up today's video, guys, so tell me how you think the Canadian national teams can get through this phase, and also tell me how you would grow the CPL. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.